Welcome everybody to our first panel of the day, What's at Stake? My name is Tara Ducosel, pronounced she, her, hers. I am the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator here at Nonprofit New York, and I'm really excited to get us kicked off for the day. It's actually my work anniversary, so bear with me. I'm really excited to welcome you all to our esteemed panelists, and I will let them introduce themselves. I know they bring a broad background and an array of knowledge and experience to the field and to the topic today. So in no particular order, if you all could just introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Corey from the Advocacy Institute, and my pronouns are they and he, and I'm excited to be with y'all today.
Great. Hi, I'm Rose Christ. I'm the co-chair of the Public Strategies practice in New York for Coase & O'Connor. We do lobbying and government relations work, and we represent about 20 nonprofit organizations. I've dedicated most of my professional career to advocating on behalf of nonprofits. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Good morning. I am Nayela Amaru, and I come here as Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for a nonprofit called Women Creating Change, where we are really focused on addressing issues, specifically policy campaigns through a gendered lens that lead to gender equity and racial justice throughout the city and throughout the state. And I come to this conversation with 22 years of experience working specifically on issue advocacy campaigns at every level of government. So really excited for this conversation.
Good morning. My name is Joanne Yu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. We're an umbrella for Asian-led, Asian serving. I think there's about 130 that we're working with because we're upstate now. It's exciting. Thank you for inviting me. My second hat here is that I am the co-chair of Nonprofit New York. So, you know, it's always nice to come in and put some love and thought into all the great work that this organization is doing.
Thank you all. Again, we're all very excited to have you. So as you know, through the various hats you've all worn and presently wear, the data indicates that most nonprofits don't engage in any sort of advocacy work or lobbying efforts whatsoever, which leaves their expertise as well as their community's voices and their needs out of policymaking. And as someone who has had experience, working with policymakers and legislators as a staffer, I know firsthand just how much the policymakers, the legislators, not only need the support of nonprofit organizations to better serve their constituency, they actually are constantly seeking y'all out for your community's voices. And so with organizations not engaging in advocacy work, that really leaves many of those communities unable to actually be in those rooms and have a place at the table to state what is going on, how the rules, policy can be made better and in their communities. And so I want to get started with a question that, I hope it's a bit challenging for you all. And so I just, knowing that, knowing just the fact that, you okay? I'm sorry, I'm going on and she's over here just, you good? All right. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. So just knowing that there is this sort of power dynamic in which nonprofits actually have this level of power, because we know that policymakers need and seek you all out, why aren't nonprofits engaging in advocacy? And why aren't they engaging in this more challenging and radical advocacy efforts, aside, of course, from trying to get their contracts or trying to get, a grant, some sort of funding for a program or service?
I can start. I can give a perspective from the Asian American community, because I think a lot of the nonprofits in our community are small. And so I think they feel very powerless to stand up for themselves, to be able to And the reality is, for all the nonprofits, all we're doing right now is trying to get people fed and not get evicted from their homes and making sure that they have health services. So I don't think people think it's also, our work is so compartmentalized. So I don't think anybody thinks like, my part of my advocacy is to do this, to be able to move this. I, I think we don't have the capacity because of the crisis that we're in that we think about those terms. And so for us, like at the Federation, it is my job to think about all that. And I tell everybody all the time, you know, I'm the executive director, but people say, what do you do? I always say, I'm an advocate. And for us, and I realize why small nonprofits are scared. Well, first of all, for Asian community, many of them are run by immigrants. So some of the system is new. So, you know, you don't really speak out against the government. And I'm telling everybody, you speak out all damn day, right? Like, don't care what they say. What are they gonna do, right? What are they gonna do? Because there's safety in numbers. And if you're feeling that way, everybody in the sector is feeling that way. And I'm always reminding my nonprofits, you are part of a social justice movement, which makes you have to stand up when something is wrong. But I think it is the power dynamic of size, but it's also the capacity. A lot of people are scared that their money is going to be taken away. That's why they're not standing up. We have seen, part of my French, but we have seen some shit policies come down from federal, state, and city, right? People are afraid to say anything because they're like, oh, does this mean I'm not going to get my grant? Does this mean X, Y, Z? And I'm thinking, if you feel like this policy is going to impact the people you serve, trust me, everybody's feeling that way. So we do have to seek out places and allies to be able to speak up. I think, you know, this fear of my money is going to be taken away is a big fear, because I'm going to tell you something. Some of our elected officials are vindictive, right? And so I know that I'm on a lot of people's shit list. So, you know, they hold up your contracts, they look at you sideways, they don't want to do anything with you. But that's part of being an advocate, that you've got to take the hits, but you can't be afraid either, right? So I think it's a lot of different dynamics. Communities of color, we've always been left out of the table. We're not invited. And I'm going to say, even in 2024, oftentimes I go to a meeting and I'm thinking, why am I the only person of color here? Where are the Black and Latino siblings? Shouldn't we all be here together? And I realized that the role that because I had this conversation with a good friend of mine who works in cure violence, that there's a lot of privilege I have being an Asian woman because I think they think I'm safe. So I have to come in and represent a lot of people of color, which is really unfair. But I know that in those spaces, I do have to raise the question of, where are the other community folks? Where are other people who look like New York City? Why am I the only one here? And I do have to ask those questions. But I think it's the system, and I think it is money, and I think it is just being overwhelmed every day.
Just very quickly, top line, advocacy helps your nonprofit meet its mission, right? And I imagine somewhere in your mission statement, there's this term equity or equitable or thriving or safety or healing threaded somewhere in all of your mission statements, right? With that said, advocacy is such a critical tool for nonprofits to move from just being responders to being active agents who are actively engaged in trying to change the policies, the structures, the institutions that change the material conditions of the clients that you serve, the organizations that you work in, and the communities that your clients and your workforce live in, right? So I think it's important just to kind of frame that larger understanding to the structural issues that Joanne just mentioned, right, as to the challenges. And so I think when we're really talking about the challenges of advocacy, yes to everything plus one that was just raised, I also think it's really important to think about the power dynamics. In my line of work, in all the advocacy hats that I've worn, you have formal structures of power, and then you have your informal structures of power, right? And I think it's really important, especially for Black and Brown led organizations that serve primarily Black and Brown communities, however that manifests, that we challenge as a sector what power is, who has it, how we can build it, and how we use it, because there is collective power from folks that we can, who don't necessarily have traditional titles or traditional access to political channels. But by identifying informal ways that you can engage in advocacy, I know there's a panel to talk a little bit more deeply about the direct and indirect and all that good stuff, which is very important. But advocacy is not necessarily just lobbying, vote for this bill, don't vote for this bill, right? Advocacy is storytelling. Advocacy is, reframing and telling on your own terms through an organizational lens with a very centered human connection and human story, the impact that government policies and budgets have on your clients, on your workforce, and on their communities. So I just wanted to add that +1 to everything that was just raised, but to also the importance of reimagining power, especially for the folks who often come from communities that don't have traditional access to it.
I think just getting back to the question of like, why are nonprofits not engaging in advocacy? I do think that the concern about sort of the cap on how much advocacy you can do before it triggers lobbying registration requirements is a big concern. Even among the organizations that have retained me as their lobbyist have concerns about how much work are they doing on their own time independent of our contract, and are they triggering that? So I just want to say, full support for the legislation to raise the cap. I think it's so important that individual organizations have the capacity to get out there, make their voices heard, engage with their legislators directly, and really it's been too low for too long. I also want to echo there's power in numbers, right? So I think there is a real concern, and I've seen it play out in real time where organizations lose funding, lose relationships, lose access because they've been sort of like the canary in the coal mine calling out issues about policy or funding cuts or whatever it is. And one of the most effective things I've seen over the 15 years I've been doing this is when there's cross-sectional, intersectional coalitions that come together to band together with a unified voice and push back against policy or budget cuts that are impacting their individual constituencies. And then from within that, your organization can raise its own profile too, right? So by bringing some of the bigger institutional players to the table, right, the smaller organizations get access into those rooms. I'm not saying the system is right. I'm not saying the system is perfect. I'm saying my advice to my clients is always, how can we work the system as it exists to get you the seat at the table that you deserve, right? And I think that doing coalition work and bringing together, again, people from all kinds of different communities to have a unified voice is a really effective way of doing that.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with what everyone has said. And, you even heard the assembly member say that like Albany is lonely and opaque, even for a state legislature. And the system is like this on purpose, right? Like the governmental system is designed to keep wealthy white men in power and to enrich corporations rather than communities. And so that's part of the reason that the Advocacy Institute exists, to really break down these processes and the political landscape and help folks understand, like, okay, this is how it really works, both how it's supposed to work and also how it actually works. And so as Naila was saying, like the reason that we engage in advocacy is if we're not working at the systems change level, then we're just putting a Band-Aid on it, right? And, in this place of breathing in love, it's, your mission might be, I want to be the best homeless service provider, but your vision is that people aren't homeless, right? And that only happens when folks are, when low-income communities of color are being organized together to exercise their power and alter the balance of power, right? Hold government accountable, become part of government and go through co-governance. That's something that JGR definitely, that Jessica Gonzalez Rojas definitely embodies. The good news is, so you might be like, okay, well, I'm a service provider, or I do research, or I do legal work. I'm not really set up to like organize communities and like help them feel, develop their relationship, their leadership, and help them feel a sense of their own power. The good news is there's lots of coalitions that are already organized that way. And it's critical, as folks are saying, that people power is coming together, right? Like one lobbyist or one staff member with really good relationships could maybe get a policy passed, but they're not ultimately altering that longer term balance of power. So there's already groups that are organizing on the issues that your clients or constituency are impacted by. You can join coalitions like Housing Justice for All or Communities Not Cages and plug into that kind of work that is already happening. And you can also get your feet wet in more supporting your day-to-day mission in terms of some of the campaigns, like they were talking about nonprofit New York campaigns around the lobbying threshold or the 15% budget cuts, or Human Services Coalition has a campaign around how much nonprofit workers are getting paid by government contracts. And you can build relationships with your local legislator to get discretionary funding from the city council, for example. All those kinds of things can be kind of like, okay, I'm kind of understanding what this political system is, I'm dipping my toes in it. But really don't forget that longer term vision that you have, because if we're not changing the fundamental structures and the root causes that are making people's lives terrible, then we're not ultimately going to build this vision of racial justice and economic justice that we all have for the New York City and the state. Oh, and let me just say one other thing about funders, which is funders are freaking out right now, right? Like, I just got an email a couple days ago from this beautiful institution asking me to ensure them that our leadership development program, which primarily focuses on developing the leadership of women of color advocates, doesn't discriminate based on race. So like, they're like, oh no, this affirmative action policy came out, like, make sure that you tell us that you're still legal. But let's just remember that funders follow the movement, right? Like, when everyone was in the streets and the uprising in 2020, funders were falling over themselves being like, we have to show that we care about Black people. Like, they go where we show them the energy is. And so being part of this movement in a broader sense is really important and really helps us bring the resources that we need to our communities.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Corey. So you all have spoken a little bit to some of the external, internal risks of not engaging in lobbying. For some of the external risks, again, if you're not speaking up and telling your story, somebody else will. And the internal risk, again, you're not, fulfilling your organization's mission. And so since we've kind of discussed some of the risks, I'd like to kind of pivot a little bit to the benefits of it. And so I'd like to ask you all, what are some of the benefits to effective lobbying that organizations in the communities might not be considering?
Money. Right? I mean, funding, discretionary funding, funding for your programs. I know we've talked a little today about sort of funding for systems change, right? Or advocacy for systems change, rather, which is super important, but none of that's possible if your organization isn't well resourced to be able to meet its mission, right? And then do the additional work, for those of you that are not advocacy-based nonprofits, of advocating within your sector, right? And so being an advocate for your organization, telling your story, putting yourself out there, not only can translate into direct funding today for the programs or for the capital needs that your organization might have. I do a lot of that capital work, but also can help raise your profile so that private funders find you. I hear all the time from my clients that the private funders want to see what the government is doing, right? And it can put you into the position to do really exciting things in partnership with the city that might not be sort of top of your mind. I'm working on a super exciting project in East Harlem with my client Afro-Latin Jazz Alliance, which is here today on Timbale Terrace. And part of the reason they were selected to be the cultural anchor there is because Afro-Latin Jazz Alliance has been putting itself out there, consistently talking about its work in communities all around the city, right? And so when East Harlem was going through its process to determine what community-based organization they wanted to see have a new home in their community, Alja was on that list. And so sometimes it's a long game, but if you're not doing the work, someone else is going to be talking about the work they're doing in your sector, right? And so I think it's really important to dedicate those resources to put yourself forward. So money is my short answer.
And the capacity to influence policy, right? Because we all work within the system, and every day you're sitting there thinking, if this little thing changed, it would just be so much easier for everybody, right? But if you don't speak up, who's gonna know, right? And the other thing I think is really exciting about all things advocacy is the fact that you get to work with people from outside your community, which I think is really critical. I think sometimes we're so, um, caught up in the day to day that you always think like, I'm serving these people and this is who my work is. And so oftentimes, as the umbrella, I tell my nonprofits, oh, by the way, the community that doesn't look like you, they don't speak your language, but they have the exact same issue. Why don't you guys get together to figure out how you're going to pool resources? So I have hundreds of stories of how that solidarity is playing out in real life, because the reality is the Asian community cannot be the only ones to save the Asian community. The Black community cannot be the only solution to supporting and saving the Black community. It really has to be a cohesive effort. During the height of anti-Asian hate, I would always say the safety of New Yorkers isn't, everybody would say, what is the solution? And I said, why do you ask victims what the solution is? Like, we're just trying to stay alive. And I think this is true for all things advocacy. The reality is, it's on all of us to be able to uplift every community, because we cannot save ourselves because some of us are too small. We're Asian American community. We're very proud of the fact that we are 18% of the population, but that's a small number. So if we combine forces and work in solidarity with groups, communities, organizations that have the same mission, that might be in the same neighborhood, or maybe not, but we understand what the issues are, think about how impactful that could be. And so those are the things that we're really pushing towards. And also, oftentimes, it's lonely in Albany, but it's lonely in the nonprofit level too, because sometimes you think like, am I seeing this problem? What is the solution? So being able to talk to your peers beyond your own community to say, this is the challenge I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And to be able to think of dynamic ways to share information, share programs, to be able to refer cases out. That's been really exciting. We've seen, I use anti-Asian hate as an example, that there were victims from other communities that I didn't have, from the Latino community, for instance. I didn't have the capacity. I do have a Spanish-speaking staff, by the way, but it needed to be somebody who had the cultural expertise and could refer somebody out to be able to serve in a full way, not just the translation, to be able to give a full range of services. So it's nice to be able to pick up the call and call somebody who is fluent in that to say, could we share some resources? Could we do this together? And I think that's what really building community is. And I think we all have this shared model and understanding of what this work can mean. But I think in many ways, we are embodying that, like we are playing that out in real life, whether it's super visible or if it's quietly on an everyday basis. So I think that's what's really exciting about the work that we're all doing together.
I would just add yes to strengthened organizations and changing policies and more money. Those are really important outcomes. I think it's also important to, shed some light on process. So for me, as someone who has gone through the work of building coalitions at every stage and through advocacy, empowerment, right, to me is a really important part of that process. Empowerment of your clients, empowerment of your workforce, empowerment of organizations, board directors, nonprofit volunteers, really have an opportunity to actively engage and use their own agency to be a part of solving the problem. And using their talent, time, and treasure as needed to be able to really focus on systems change, systems at the institution level, at the policy level. So I just thought it was important to acknowledge the process part of empowerment and how that can lead to sustained engagement. And if I haven't mentioned once, I'll mention it, is the importance of joining coalitions. Elected officials don't pass bills, coalitions do. So if you're not part of a coalition, join one. And it just really amplifies the point that Joanne made in terms of the impact of collective power and a shared vision and commitment to making that change by pooled resources.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. And I would say that winning concrete improvements in people's lives as a way to go towards this longer term vision is, one of the most important pieces of it, right? That, it's definitely about people exercising their power and building power as communities, and also 86% of kids getting free breakfasts and lunches is like actually on the day to day, helping the constituency that you all are serving. And because I didn't talk about this when we were talking about barriers, I'll just add, don't forget when you join this coalition that is organizing the base and, helping your folks mobilize and plug into it, don't forget that your frontline program staff actually need space in their work plans to do that mobilization of themselves and your clients, because we're obviously, all of the nonprofit staff are already like stretched to the limit and working really hard, and the challenges that folks in the community are facing are very real, and we need to make sure that we're also being sustainable and just workplaces where folks can actually not burn out and be able to still do their jobs.
Thank you all. And Joanne, Nyla, I think you all kind of touched a little bit on my next question or follow-up. So again, our members and organizations in the nonprofit sector, again, they're dedicated to empowering, serving, and collaborating with historically marginalized communities. And I kind of wanted an opportunity for you all to elaborate a little bit more on how lobbying works to raise that solidarity. I know, Joanne, that you mentioned it a little bit, just in terms of being able to, in a sense, outsource or refer some of your constituency that come into your organizations to a neighboring community or organization that is doing similar work or addressing similar needs. But I'd also like for us to kind of touch on some of the racial leadership for these orgs that are serving marginalized communities, as well as, again, the decision-making in the sector, including policymakers as well. So the solidarity component of not just the leaders of nonprofit organizations, but also how that impacts the racial disparities in leadership in working with policymakers.
So the Asian American Federation is part of the nonprofit Communities of Color Nonprofit Stabilization Fund, because we realize that we have to build capacity in Black, Latino, Asian nonprofits because we are bleeding leadership. And part of the reason is because we don't even have the internal capacity, we don't have the support to build internal capacity. I think we're going into year 5 or 7. And so there's a lot of really great work being done. And for us, if we're doing a workshop on, this is what advocacy is, this is how you track lobbying time. And I tell everybody, don't be afraid of lobbying, right? It's just a pain in the neck to like keep track of hours, but everybody should be doing this. And I'm always very tricky with my legal degree. It's like, it's a fine line, it's a fine line between lobbying and advocacy. You can figure out how to word that properly. And I feel like my role at the Federation is to serve as my community's lobbyist, right? And so if I hear 3 stories, I'm gonna go and say something to somebody. The other thing also is we work very closely with the Nonprofit Stabilization Fund. It's with New York Urban League and with Hispanic Federation, right? When we sat down to think about this, there are shared challenges that we have about how we sustain the nonprofits that support our communities. I think that's what came about. The second part, this is very exciting, and I'm sorry I didn't get to say thank you to Assembly Member, to JGR, because we are launching, breaking news, we've asked for money for Black, Latino, Asian mental health initiative in New York State. Because the thing that we see, I mean, this is the conversation you have with your girlfriends at breakfast, right? I'm sitting there and I said, you guys, oh my God, my community, they don't talk to anybody. People are having breakdowns, and we don't even have the capacity to go see a therapist. I don't know what the heck is going on. Is it just my community? And the stigma, is it my community? My Black and Latina sisters, they said, oh no, it's all of us, right? So I've sat down with some of the other the leadership groups and to say, I think we go in and ask for money. I think now this day and age, we have to figure out the solidarity piece. But it's not just like, I want to stand with you just for standing together's sake. Here is a shared crisis in our community, and how we're going to elevate this by asking for like real dollars. So we put a number, and it's out there. And JGR, when we mentioned it to her, she said, "Oh, let me carry it for you," right? I think that's the solidarity piece. So like, we were all on the phone yesterday, like, when you guys, assembly member, you need to sign on. But it's because we have a shared challenge. And I think this is what it means to build a network of allies and friends and people you can confide in, that is beyond your own community, because you get to learn that everybody's going through the same thing. But for communities of color, we've been siloed and isolated so much that we don't even realize. It is very lonely, because you think, oh my God, my community is the only one going through this. Why is 85% of the mental health providers in this country white? Which means, where do you send your Black, Latino, Asian kids, right? Like, how come nobody's building a pipeline? Why are we not talking about this? So there's opportunity, when you talk to build solidarity, it has to be real, because I think sometimes, like, standing in solidarity, I sometimes see it as performative, and I think, like, whatever, right? There's like people doing real on the ground work to be like, get to the table, what do you need? Okay, you take a chunk of this, you're gonna do this, and we're gonna do this together, because this impacts everybody, because literally our people are dying, right? Like, these are really critical conversations of how we move the needle. Because the other thing also is, if you look around with all the legislative bodies, federal, state, city, not a whole lot of people look like us, right? For the Asian community, I think we celebrate like 6 people in city council, 5 people, like, of 51, like 6, like, these are not things we celebrate, because it's a small number. And so they themselves have to figure out who their allies are and how do they move the needle inside. But unless we all come together to ask for things together that impact the entire city, I think that's what's been really, I will tell you, that's probably the most joyful part of my work, is because I get to call up people all the time, like, Arva, we need to get together and have this conversation now, right? That is the most joyful part of my work, that I get to work with people outside of my own community, that I get to text people regularly and be like, you guys better be calling people now, right? Or to say, this is what I'm seeing, how do we work together? And I think there is this network is being built. Anytime one of us does a training and we say, oh, would the Black and Latino community like to come to this training? Because if I'm paying for a professional to come in and do a training, we need to like pack that room so everybody gets the same level of knowledge. I think that's how we are thinking about it, and that's how we're sharing resources. And I think it's not building solidarity for like this solidarity's sake, but it's like, we've got to do this work together. So everybody needs to have the same set of tools to be able to move forward, to do the best work that we can as part of the social justice movement.
Absolutely. Plus to everything that was just said. It's an open secret that a majority of nonprofit organizations are led by white women. And I think important to name the differences, complications when it comes to funding. Again, there's a lot of research that says if you are a Black or Brown-led nonprofit organization, you're probably not going to get as much funding and as often from founders from, name your funding source. And so I think it's important when we acknowledge the structural racism within the funding structure and how that impacts as resources to do work in the community. We are then left with the question of, if folks who have personal lived experiences do not have access to take the helm of organizations that do have formal scope, influence, and power to talk about issues in a way that is personal and rooted in lived experience, then what we have oftentimes is performative, right? So I think it's important just to name that part to begin with and frame this conversation. Next, one of my deepest privileges when I was executive director of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus lifetimes ago for the City Council, was being able to work with nonprofits such as Urban League with Arvin Rice, who is one of my mentors, who I've learned so much from, but really understanding the power of collective organizing, the power of when you have nonprofit organizations across the city who who are led by Black and Brown EDs who have a very, very specific constituency that they serve. And there is a channel through government that we can commit dedicated resources to the investment of our own people. That's an amazing opportunity to not just build power, but to create policies and funding that can make differences that change the material conditions of the folks that we're trying to serve. However, again, the broader issue is that's just one caucus, right? That's just one small coalition, small but mighty. And so then how then do we think about the consequences of not having Black and Brown-led organizations and how that has this cascading impact on funding and who is invited to the table, right? Because whoever is invited to the table has this incredible opportunity to talk about issues through a very specific way, but you're talking about that issue in a way that does not really connect or is not relevant to the clients that you're trying to serve because you don't have that perspective. Then what we have is government trying to fund the wrong thing. We have policies that do not solve the real issues that need to be solved. And so I think it's important just to kind of step back and acknowledge all of that, but also to hold space and recognize that there are opportunities for us to connect and understand that we may be in our silo here, but there are, through, again, structural issues, shared pains, right? And building power at those intersections of pain that lead to opportunity to change it.
Can I add something?
Oh, hold on. All right, so I'm getting the 1 minute mark. So if we can.
I just wanted to, build off of what they both said and just invite us for white folks who are running nonprofits in the city. We have an assignment, right? Kind of like what Joanne was saying about why are you asking the victims how to stop anti-Asian hate, is like we're the ones who are benefiting from and who created systemic racism, and we have an assignment to dismantle it. And one of the ways and so there's lots of ways that we can think about, like, how do we show up for that fight? How do we be effective in that fight in terms of the leadership development that we're supporting at the staff level for folks to be able to move up in our organizations and take on leadership, and in terms of the ways that we're intentionally joining coalitions that are accountable to low-income BIPOC communities to be able to take that leadership and listen and not think that we have all the answers.
Thank you so much, Corey, for that add-on. And we are essentially at time for this panel. I want to thank you all again for all of your insight and wisdom and words. Thank you, thank you.